Now on Islam Channel, The Report.
Good evening. Welcome to The Report with me, John Rees. On the programme tonight, we will bring you a reaction to the news that Zac Goldsmith has been selected as the Tory candidate for the mayoral election here in London. We'll also be discussing the International Criminal Court prosecution of a Mali national charged with destroying cultural artefacts in Timbuktu. But first, Russian warplanes have carried out a new wave of airstrikes against opponents of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad amid growing concerns that many of those hit were civilians. Afsal Ahmed has more.
Russia maintains that the airstrikes over the last 48 hours are aimed at the Islamic State group and what they say are terrorist organizations. In a visit to France, the Russian President Vladimir Putin discussed the issue with his French counterpart François Hollande. France is a member of the US-led coalition against the Islamic State group in Syria and Iraq. Joining countries such as Turkey and Saudi Arabia, they call on Russia to cease its aerial campaign. They say instead of hitting the IS group, they have been hitting Western-backed Syrian rebels. Russian jets hit areas in the suburbs of Hama and Idlib, all areas said to be under the control of a loose coalition of rebel groups, including the Western-backed Free Syrian Army. Activists on the ground also say the majority of the attacks hit civilian targets, a claim that Russia strongly denies. President Putin says the claims are all part of information warfare. Alleged reports have also surfaced from Lebanon that hundreds of Iranian troops have arrived in Syria in the last 10 days and will soon join Syrian government forces and the Lebanese Hezbollah allies in a major ground offensive backed by Russian airstrikes. If true, the development points to an emergency military alliance between Russia and Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's other main allies, focused on recapturing areas of northwestern Syria that were seized by opposition fighters in rapid advances earlier this year. Putin's decision this week to launch airstrikes on Syria marked a dramatic escalation of foreign involvement in a 4-year-old civil war in which every major country in the region has a stake. It also signals the first time since World War II that Cold War superpower foes, Russia and the United States, are now flying combat missions over the same country. Afsal Ahmed, The Report.
Well, now joining me in the studio is political commentator Abdullah al Andalusi, co-founder of the Muslim Debate Initiative. On the line is Middle East political expert and former Palestinian diplomat Saeb Shaath. And on the line is Borzou Daragahi, who is a Middle East correspondent for Buzzfeed News. Welcome to the programme, all of you. Abdullah, your response, first of all, to this new the deployment of Russian airstrikes.
Well, I think it's the US permitting Russia to do its dirty work for it. Russia doesn't want one faction or another. So USA doesn't want one faction or another coming out ahead, mainly because of US's concerns that if they get rid of the Syrian regime, then an Islamic regime representing the desires of the people will arise, and that's not what US wants. At the same time, it has to give some pretense to helping those who are rebelling against the Assad regime, so that they can come to a negotiation table. And
when you say the Islamic regime representing the views of the people, probably the likely outcome would be that the Islamic State takes power in Damascus. You aren't suggesting that that reflects the views of the Syrian people? Oh
no, ISIS their main lifeline has been Bashar al-Assad from the get-go, when even the US commented that Bashar al-Assad is providing air support for ISIS advances against rebels. We see that ISIS spend, according to many military surveys, 64% of their military operations specifically targeting the rebels against the Syrian regime. And the fact that Bashar al-Assad does oil deals with ISIS and even pay for civil servants in Raqqa to provide civil services, public services to the people of Raqqa under ISIS control. So why would Bashar al-Assad do so unless ISIS have some kind of benefit for him?
Well, we'll come back to that, because there was obviously a question hanging there that if the regime controls about a quarter of the territory and the Islamic State controls about half the territory and their allies, what's the problem?
Well, I think that the problem is, first and foremost, that obviously ultimately no one wants to have ISIS there for the future. They're very useful for Bashar al-Assad. They saved his regime by the fact that they put pressure on the rebels who were supported.
So they might be fighting the same people, but they're not necessarily allied, is your point. Let me bring Saeb in. Saeb, more bombing by the Russians is going to make this situation worse. There's already reports that civilians are being killed. There's no bomb so smart that it won't kill civilians. So this is a bad thing, surely.
I just want to comment, first of all, about Daesh and the Syrian regime. We are all aware of the photographs circulating in the internet and the social media of the Senator John McCain when he trespassed in Syria from Turkey and met the leaders of these terror gangs in the north of Syria. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the head of ISIL, was there in the photograph beside John McCain. That in its own, without me explaining it, says a whole lot.
Yeah, but let me get your reaction to the deployment of the Russian aircraft, because that's the breaking news.
There is a shocking hypocrisy in here by many writers and politicians covering all over the Western media space. According to the mainstream media, we are expected to consider the Russians villains now because they are attacking the terrorist gangs in Syria, and they are, as we told, these terroristic groups, ISIL or Jabhat al-Nusra, who is considered by a resolution of the United Nations, are terrorist gangs and our enemy when we're supposed to destroy. Today, when the Russians doing this job and they are attacking them after nearly 2 years of the Americans' alliance of 60 states trying to target ISIL in Iraq, and they know every corner where ISIL is in Iraq, by the way.
So your view is, Saeb, let me just, I'm struggling here to get your view. So your view is that the Russian bombing is a good thing, but Western bombing is a bad thing. Do I have that correctly?
My view is the Russian, at least, they started doing the job, which the Western allies supposed to started doing that a year and a half ago, and nothing happened.
Okay, that's clear. Thanks. That's clear. Thanks very much, Borzou. What do you think is going to be the outcome here? We now have, a kind of party of bombers from practically every corner of the globe bombing Syrian territory. What do you think is going to come out of it?
I mean, first of all, I just have to say, if you're going to bring such clowns on the air, that are basically they're basically polemicists disguised as analysts.
Yeah, well, I find there's a very good journalistic rule, which if you think that you're arguing against people who don't have a good argument, you put a better one rather than calling them names. So, would you like to put a better argument?
First of all, let's just say that for what the really important thing is that the Syrian people right now are, especially those in rebel-held areas that are under Bashar al-Assad's barrel bombs, as well as those who live in ISIS areas, are being pummeled. Their lives are a nightmare. They're a horror show, largely thanks to Bashar al-Assad and largely thanks to ISIS, which has been in a sort of informal alliance with Bashar al-Assad from the very beginning of this. They're, basically sort of structuring this whole war so that at the end it'll be just the two of them remaining and they can fight it out. Bashar is betting that that's the best outcome for him, and ISIS is betting that that's the best outcome for it. This is there's not a formal alliance between the two parties. Second of all, the U.S. is not endorsing these Russian airstrikes. That's just half-informed. The U.S. is utterly confused and has no idea what to do in Syria, has not had any idea what to do from the very beginning. It is sort of bumbling around. But to argue that that the U.S. wants Russia to do its dirty work, it means that someone has not read anything whatsoever in the past 4 years.
I take it. I get your point about that you disagree with the other commentators. I'm asking you for your view, though. What do you think is going to be the likely outcome of the Russian bombing now?
I think very, very likely outcome is going to be more suffering for ordinary Syrian people, more refugees, more people displaced. This rumor, this Reuters report that citing two unnamed quote-unquote Lebanese sources that Iranian troops are going to help out the Russians. I don't know about that. I think that's probably not true. The Iranians have already categorically and officially denied that claim. But what's probably going to happen is that the country's going to be further torn apart. There's, I think, a few possibilities. One is that the Russians are content to follow that Iranian strategy of just, forgetting about eastern and northeastern and even northern Syria possibly, and just concentrating on Damascus and the coastal areas and keeping that sort of Syrian space, keeping that under the control of the government, and just let the others fall under the control of whoever. And another, very real possibility is that, the U.S. or the U.S.'s allies will decide, you know what, Russia, game on. And they start giving the rebels those man-pads and those better weapons that they've always wanted. And then you're going to start seeing Russian planes being shot down. You're going to start seeing jihadi truck bombs driven into air bases and other facilities operated by the Russians. And then you're just going to see a big backlash in Russia. Possibly.
Okay, let me put some of those points to Abdullah. Do you think that the war could develop in that way, with Russian deployment or possibly Iranian deployment, and then a kind of intensification of the reaction because the Americans might move to actually give a greater degree of weaponry and support to the rebels than they have done so far?
Well, America intends to create some or maintain an equilibrium until there can be negotiations of which America will benefit from. They don't want to see an Islamic future for Syria under the non-prescribed groups which have the backing of the Syrian people, the Islamic Front and the Syrian Front and so on. So there's many such groups which are not prescribed, they're not terrorists internationally. They have the support of the Syrian people, but because they have or they avow an Islamic objective for Syria, openly avow so with Sharia, America doesn't want to see that. And so now the talk of what America had all along, which was to see Bashar al-Assad part of a solution for Syria, and America's been doing this for a few years, trying to bring a negotiated solution between the sides. If one side starts edging and creating an imbalance, that was rectified by America's kind of counter moves in Russia. So what we see, for example, is that America trains rebels only to attack ISIS, and it bombs only ISIS. And now it tried to bomb non-ISIS targets last year. It faced a backlash from the rebels and the people on the ground. So now Russia can fit that with America making public disavowals of it, but Russia can now focus on that. And the fact America hasn't implemented any enhanced sanctions against any arms dealers that do business with the Syrian regime. For example, the Russian arms exporter Rosoboronexport, which is a major arms supplier to the Syrian regime. America didn't actually give sanctions against this company, but instead actually did even more business, did business with that company, bought helicopters to supply the Afghan army. So America's not really serious about limiting arms supplies to Bashar al-Assad. It's not serious about limiting or restricting Bashar al-Assad in any meaningful way, other than to bring all the sides to a negotiation table, which will create a Syria that America wants. And
on the other hand, people say this, but actually the UN negotiations broke down on precisely this point, American opposition to Bashar al-Assad.
Well, actually, they broke down mainly because the opposition refused to basically do any compromises that would allow Bashar al-Assad a future, or the regime as it exists a future, whereas many American secretaries of state and so on and so forth have mentioned that they want to preserve the regime as much as possible to prevent anarchy and chaos and presumably an Islamic future for Syria based on what the people's avowed desires. The very fact that the largest factions of the Syrian opposition are Islamic groups is sufficient to evidence that.
But your case won't stand, because if the Americans loved Bashar al-Assad as much as you say, and the Russians loved Bashar al-Assad as much as you say, the joint discussions between their militaries wouldn't have broken down.
Not really, because with Bashar al-Assad, Americans wanted to get rid of Bashar al-Assad to have a different kind of regime from him, but the same kind of secular regime, same kind of Arab nationalistic regime as before. What you saw was a disagreement between the powers, between Iran, between Russia and the United States and Europe, as to whether Bashar al-Assad will be useful for that new Syria or not. And right now, they're coming to the terms that, well, Bashar al-Assad might be the required aspect or linchpin for the next Syria, whereas America would have preferred maybe a secular Syria under its control, like other Arab regimes in the region, but preferably without Bashar al-Assad. But they're now seeing that the way that things are going, they might need to keep Bashar al-Assad in. This is why you see a big U-turn from all the Western powers regarding keeping Bashar al-Assad in, despite the fact he's used chemical weapons against people, barrel bombs and mass killings.
Okay. Saeb, has Putin got a problem at home with this? The recent opinion polls show some 60% of Russians opposed to intervention in Syria.
I don't know about that, but let me say about what your two guests talking here. Just a few months ago, WikiLeaks showed us documents with the U.S. plans for regime change in Syria. And these plans go back to 2006. That is 5 years before the colored Syrian Spring or revolution, or what you want to call it. And let's as well remember when Rumsfeld, the former U.S. Defense and the Vice President Cheney for W. Bush administration, they were making remarks after their invasion of Iraq straight away of their plans for similar fate for Syria. So these guys, I don't know where they're getting their information from. And in here, when we're talking about the outrageous, evil Russian who's launching attacks and airstrikes on Syria.
Yeah, Saeb, so my question to you was, given the fact that in opinion polls 60% of Russians oppose their government's intervention in Syria, does Vladimir Putin have a problem at home?
Putin has a permission from his parliament. He took the permission of the Russian Duma, the parliament, before he took any strike.
Yeah, but as we know, the British Parliament approved the attack on Iraq, but it didn't mean to say that Tony Blair didn't have a problem with British public opinion.
Yes, of course, you're right in here. And if Putin has a problem with his own people, he has to sort that with the people, the Russian people. They don't want to see their soldiers. This is the thing. Nobody wants to see their own boys dying. Like your guests in here, they're propagating death in Syria. When we look at settling the situation, anybody, the Russian people don't want to see their own army interfering in that. But Russia at least has this alliance with the Syrian regime goes nearly 60 years from the times before the times of even the Assad, and so it's from the 50s, and they are keeping supporting their allies, not like the United States of America can pick them and drop them, like it did with when we see in the arming and rearming of what was supposed to be the moderate Syrian rebels. What moderate? When they spend billions on them.
Okay.
Probably you have, as the Congress said, 5 and
okay.
And they surrender their
thanks.
weapons.
Thanks very much. Borzou, do you think now that there is going to be a serious ground deployment of Iranian troops or not?
No, I absolutely don't. I mean, I saw the Reuters report. I thought it was suspicious and it looked weird from the very beginning. I think that there's a possibility with things somewhat settled down in Iraq, not calm or resolved, but things sort of locked in a stalemate in Iraq. You will see some Iraqi Shia militias going back to Syria. You will definitely see Hezbollah fighters who've never really left going back to Syria. But I seriously doubt you're going to see, the way the Reuters report wrote, ground troops, hundreds of Iranian ground troops getting deployed there, for the simple reason that Iranians would also have a huge problem with that. Maybe some advisors, commandos, but Iranians don't want to get involved in the morass of Syria.
Well, let's just ask you about another story that's also circulating in the sort of margins of the mainstream now, which is about the deployment of the Chinese aircraft carrier off Syria. Is that, do you think, a similarly unrealistic story?
I just don't know. I haven't seen that. I mean, there's a lot of rumors. Let's just be careful. Let's not do fact-free analysis. Especially when you're talking about the U.S. administration. There's many people in the U.S. administration who've made many different comments. For example, this guy before referring to this WikiLeaks document, it was about like, some ways of putting pressure on if you read the document from 2006, and this was during the Cheney era. And even back then, they weren't seriously talking about regime change. They were talking about ways that we can put a little bit of pressure on Bashar to modify some of his behaviors so he's not such a jerk in Lebanon and other places, and he stops letting jihadis into Iraq. If you read that document that's being bandied about by these pro-Bashar flunkies, that's what you see. It doesn't describe a conspiracy to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. There was never any conspiracy to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. It was always a popular uprising that was met with just extreme violence by the Bashar regime, and that eventually, as many people predicted, radicalized the opposition, encouraged them to take up arms, and that's why you have the situation you have now.
Okay. Borzou Daragahi, thank you very much for joining us. Abdullah al Andalusi in the studio, and of course Saeb Shaath, thanks for coming on the programme. Well, that's all we have time for on this subject. We're going to go for a short break now, but when we come back, we'll have a roundup of the day's news and we'll have a look at what's been happening on social media. That's after this break.